Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Garner. I'm a 9-year Navy veteran and currently completing my PhD in interdisciplinary studies at Union University and Union Institute University, where my research area is American patriotism. I'm also a guest editor for an upcoming special edition for the Journal of Veteran Studies, where we will discuss patriotism from various veteran perspectives. Today, we have a distinguished panel of scholars and veterans who will discuss American patriotism through the critical lens of their own research and/or their own experiences. Today's panel includes Dr. Maxwell Berkey, Professor of Political Science at Stockton University, Dr. Elizabeth Desnoyers-Colas, Professor of Communication at Georgia Southern University, and Mr. Brian Henry, Assistant Director of Education Abroad at the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. I would like to open this session by sharing a short overview of existing scholarship about what I feel is a timely topic this year. American patriotism is a cultural phenomenon that is at the core of American identity. What does it mean to be patriotic in 21st century America? Based upon analysis of existing scholarship, most scholars generally agree that American patriotism is associated with the strong identification with and protection of America. But simple and often reductive definitions fall short of capturing the complexity and nuance of American patriotism that has existed throughout our history. Political philosophers like Maurizio Viroli in 1995 argued that to have a country means we must have a moral obligation to preserve the common good. In this context, Viroli adds, patriots have, quote, no obligation to impose cultural, ethnic, and religious homogeneity at the expense of other people's liberty, nor to deny civil and political rights to any of our fellow patriots, end quote. Moral conceptions of patriotism would seem then compatible with racial and social justice. However, analysis of existing scholarship across multiple disciplines reveals a stark contrast between what Americans believe about their values as they relate to the country's origins and how Americans act on those values. Defining patriotism in America requires us to also address the complexity of race, ethnicity, and gender as they intersect with patriotic beliefs. Research by several scholars concludes, for example, that those who strongly identify as patriotic support the suppression of individuals or groups who hold opposing views, an indication of cultural hegemony in American patriotism. Specifically, William Gordon and colleagues in 1983 performed a research providing evidence that groups who share the same values regarding patriotism seem to support suppression of opposing views to the extent of suppressing constitutional rights of the opposing group. This contrasts with the moral framework seen in Viroli's discussion. A study by Pena and Sedanius in 2002 centered race when they measured group anti-egalitarianism and group dominance. Their evidence illustrates that among white Americans, quote, the greater the respondents' tendency to subordinate inferior groups, the greater their level of US patriotism, end quote. Simplified definitions often conflate the nuanced distinctions between patriotism and nationalism, where patriotism is positively connotes love of country, while nationalism is associated with chauvinistic, racialized, and xenophobic animus towards other groups. But are these definitions static or dynamic? Most scholars agree a commitment to a common good is a critical element to the preservation of our civil liberties. Another political philosopher, Michael Walzer, in 1974 projected, quote, what we can reasonably expect to have in a contemporary democratic multicultural society is a balance of civility and civic virtue in which civility is the predominant component, end quote. Nonetheless, research illustrates patriotic identity is influenced by one's social location and is a strong indicator of one's political, social, and cultural perspectives. For most of us here today, the moral obligation to preserve a common good was manifested by our military service. But while military service is considered by some Americans to be central to American patriotic identity, fewer people now serve in the military in comparison to previous generations. A 2020 Council on Foreign Relations report reveals 1.3 million people are currently on active duty, which accounts for less than 0.5% of the total US population. If most of the population does not have a personal connection to military service, then perceptions of patriotism shaped by the pathway of military service can skew how patriotism is conceptualized. American patriotism defies a simple definition, and existing research proves race, ethnicity, and gender are central elements. And these elements have illustrated there are paradoxes for individuals outside of the cultural norm, particularly regarding the patterns and practices of language, as well as the iconography of American patriotism. The present state of the scholarly discussion about American patriotism illustrates that more research is needed. American patriotism is an intersectional space, a space occupied by dissimilar human beings who conceive of and experience this phenomenon based upon their lived experiences. The pathway to finding a common good, which transcends the current state of political and cultural discourse, in part includes what we are doing here today. Each panel member will present for about 10 minutes, and afterwards we will open the floor to your questions. Please place your questions in the chat box, and I now turn it over to Dr. Berkey.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you, Brian, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. I'm gonna hit on a couple of the conceptual points that Brian made there and elaborate on them a little bit before we get into more of the experiential narratives of other members of the panel. So I hope I can be helpful in that regard, especially as a non-veteran. So let's think about conceptualizing patriotism. And the first thing I want to touch on is the relationship between patriotism and democracy. As Brian noted, patriotism is a really contested terrain. So how can we make sense of it? In my own research, I found that there's really kind of three key pillars that can guide our conversation about patriotism and thinking about what it is in the first place. One is that patriotism is a language of exemplary citizenship. It communicates the ideals of citizenship, the virtues of the ideal citizen who serves and sacrifices for one's nation. So think about the way we often use the word patriot in everyday language. Oftentimes it is a compliment extended to someone who has exhibited that kind of sacrifice, oftentimes a veteran, in fact, right? So the ideals of citizenship. Secondly, patriotism is also a language of national community and fraternity and identity, right? So it doesn't just point to the virtues of the individual citizenship, but the sense of interconnectedness, togetherness, and shared emotional bonds, right, that unite us as Americans. And the third key pillar, right, is a historical story. Patriotism almost always, when used in political rhetoric, invokes a kind of historical narrative, especially one that connects our political present to our past, most often our founding and a certain notion of America's origins, especially as an exceptional democratic nation, right? So thinking in those three terms about patriotism is helpful. And when we do so, we can kind of see some of the relationships between patriotism and democracy. All three of these aspects of patriotism are central to democratic life. But American democracy has also been achieved in large part through movements for reform and resistance movements that have had to challenge patriotism on all three of these levels, right? So think about the ethic of dissent, for example, invoked by social movements for change. Well, that construes citizenship a little bit differently, right? It's not just about the virtues of sacrifice and service, but about free thinking and autonomy, right? And protest, right? So dissent is one way in which patriotism has been challenged. Also on the notion of national community, right? social movements and reform movements often highlight not what unites us, but the fault lines and inequities that divide us from one another. So there's a narrative there that challenges the notion of national community and the notion that we all share the same emotional ties to America through an emphasis on greater inclusivity rather than national identity, right? And on the question of the historical narratives about America, right? Social movements often communicate narratives that challenge our origins, right? And that are often departures from our usual national narratives, right? So on the question of historical narrative as well, right? There's a contested terrain. So all this is just to say that when we think about patriotism and its place in democracy, we're not thinking about an outright contradiction. We're not also thinking about a smooth harmony or complementarity, but we're thinking about, or I like to think about in terms of embedded tensions, right? And so I think the interesting thing for scholars like Brian or even myself is to work out how those embedded tensions play out in different historical contexts, in different institutions, like the military, for example, among different communities, like the veterans community. So I hope that helps a little bit in providing some conceptual framing. I also want to touch on the something Brian hit on a little bit, which is the relationship between patriotism and nationalism, because this has been kind of so central to how we think and debate patriotism in America. And there's really kind of two traditions here, two positions. One is the view that patriotism and nationalism are utterly distinct, right? And so this view holds that patriotism is a strictly civic disposition, not a cultural identity, as in the case of nationalism, right? Therefore, it is an inclusive politics, at least potentially, right? Rather than an exclusionary politics of us versus them in the mold of nationalism, right? And it's inherently related to America's exceptional quality as a democratic, civic, ideal-oriented nation, rather than kind of the blood and soil politics, especially the blood and soil politics that were demonstrated with the rise of fascism in the Second World War. And indeed, this distinction between patriotism and nationalism, if we look at the intellectual history of it, it's the post-World War II moment in which it gains a lot of traction, because it appealed to the kind of moral intuition that the collective identity and national sentiments of Americans were morally superior to those sentiments and identities that drove the rise of fascism in Europe, right? Of course, African Americans coming home from World War II as veterans understood that this narrative of moral superiority, right, and American exceptionalism, that is the premise of this gulf, this dichotomy between patriotism and nationalism, was more nuanced, a little more complex, right? So the debate began immediately. In fact, George Orwell, the a famous English writer, also an anti-fascist writer during the World War II period, he was the first to really drive home this distinction between patriotism and nationalism. If you're interested, there's a piece he wrote called Notes on Nationalism from 1945 that made this distinction. And it's been reiterated, including up until our own time now. In 2021, one sees it quite a bit. But immediately it was contested. So in 1946, the well-known American historian Merle Curti writes an important book, another one you could take a look at, called The Roots of American Loyalty, I believe. So 1 year after Orwell had wrote, and it's one of the foundational historical texts on American patriotism. And in the preface, Curti writes that one cannot understand American notions of American loyalty and patriotism without understanding its connection to national sentiments, in other words, to nationalism in the world over, right? So, and so the other argument here is that patriotism and nationalism are inherently intertwined. One can't parse them out from one another, right? And one sees this, right? So yes, on an abstract level of ideal types, as social scientists like to use that term, sure, it makes sense, right? But when we get into the nitty-gritty of American politics and political culture, the two are inherently enmeshed. Looking at rhetoric, for example, Lincoln is someone who is often cited as a great patriot, right? But if one looks at some of Lincoln's famous addresses, for example, the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address, one can see that Lincoln does exceed the terms of a strictly civic framework, right? He invokes notions of lineage and providence and patrimony, right? And a lot of these elements that are kind of central to more mythic notions of nationhood, right? So also, if we look at social institutions, right? Think of the history of the Pledge of Allegiance in the late 19th and early 20th century in America, and the role of the Grand Army of the Republic, which at that time was a veterans organization of Civil War veterans, who played a key role in getting the Pledge of Allegiance kind of institutionalized throughout American public schools. Well, scholars of nationalism will tell you the public school system is kind of a key bedrock institution of 19th century and 20th century nationalism, right? So if patriotism is playing such a large role there, can we really separate out patriotism and nationalism? And if we can't, is that distinction itself kind of a product of American exceptionalism itself, right? The very distinction, and that maybe we need to think about the places where there's connective tissue between patriotism and nationalism. And when we do so, that has a lot of impact on how we think about racial justice and patriotism as well. So within I was going to talk a little bit more about the African-American tradition, but I want to wrap it up and leave that to others, and maybe we could revisit it. But there's been all these two traditions. One, trying to redeem American patriotism for the purpose of racial justice, okay, in which one sees in the DNA of America the ability to realize racial justice, and therefore to ground racial justice in national identity, in narratives of national identity, versus a more oppositional tradition that's sometimes less discussed, but equally kind of prominent in this history, in which the argument is that really we need a transformation of American political culture, not just a kind of redemption of origins to realize racial justice, and that we ought to think in universal terms and connect the experiences of people of color in America to those of people of color around the world, right? And so we could discuss different figures in relation to these two different kinds of traditions. But I think it leads to the last question, which is, which I'll leave you with, which is, I think the dominant narrative, right, has been one of assuming that patriotism is the natural ally of the veteran community, right? In terms of the way it speaks to service and to sacrifice, right? But if patriotism is intertwined with nationalism, if it does sometimes stymie democratic change, if it sometimes privileges exceptionalism or national identity over issues of justice or inclusivity, right, then we want to think about whether that's the case. And that's not to suggest it's not the case, but asking the question forces us to make those connections between the veterans community and patriotism rather than assuming them. So, and I think that's one of the valuable things of these kinds of conversations. So sorry for going a minute or two over time, but I wanted to get that in there. And thanks for having me, everybody. So I'll turn it over back to Brian.
Thank you, Dr. Berkey. It was great. It was a great presentation. I want to move on now to Dr. Desnoyers Colas, who will speak to us about her experience and her research.
In 2014, I wrote a book about African-American women who have served in the Gulf Wars. It was basically an ethnographic type of book, but it mostly dealt with narrative ethnographic, where I talked about the issue of the importance of their service and also different things that they did. So, but in the course of my research, I did a historical look at African Americans in general and why our service was so important. And of course, in my research, I also found out that African American men and women have served this country since the Revolutionary War. Um, and part of our service, the impetus behind the service really was, in essence, to prove their worthiness as people in the country to serve. In other words, their service showed, we love this country, we've built this country, we want you to know that we are a part of this country, and therefore we should be able to get our rights and our equality based on the issue that we serve this country as fellow patriots. So in that light, I ended up writing the book, but the experiential thing that I want to talk about today is, when we talk about service, we don't always talk about it in this, we talk about it sometimes in a sense of the abstract aspect of service. Um, and I wanted to talk about, I'm a retired Air Force officer. I was a public affairs officer, and the last duty that I had was I was the public affairs officer for the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, which is the place where they actually train all of the equal opportunity people, the military and civilians, to serve in the military. And I had the opportunity to give a mission briefing on the institute to, at that time, 3-star um, General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who later on, I think in 2001 or something like that, or right before President Clinton gave up his, actually before the Bush and the Clinton administration ended, he gave Benjamin O. Davis Jr. another star. So I was really, I mean, that was the highlight of my career, because just a little brief biographical bit, you know that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was the first general, Black general in the United States Air Force. He was the leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. So he had a life that was a series of firsts as far as the military, as his father, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who served the military, and right before he got out of the military, they gave him his 1 star. So Benjamin O. Davis Jr., later on that evening, as he spoke to the officers who attended this briefing, he talked to us about his time at the academy. So at the West Point Academy. Now, prior to his actual graduation from the West Point Academy, there were 3 African Americans who had graduated from the academy. 2 of them went on to become chaplains, I believe, and then there was another. But Benjamin O. Davis Jr. went through a series of what they called silencing. And silencing basically was nobody talked to him. Literally, nobody talked to him. He had his own room, his own bathroom. The only people who talked to him were the instructors that he had, and they only talked to him because they felt they had to. When it was mealtime, there's a ritual where each cadet goes around to different tables and say, "May I sit here, sir?" And then, they say, "Yes, you may sit here." And then you get 4 or 5 of them, I believe, at a table, and then they all sit down. He would spend his time, he had to spend his time each day for 4 years going around to each table asking the question of, "May I sit at your table?" And they said, "Oh, permission to sit at your table, sir." And they would say, "Permission denied," for 4 years. They also had cadets at that time also had a class where they did dancing, and dancing and it was a mandatory dance class, and he had to dance by himself during that class. Um, so I believe, when he talked about this issue, he talked about the fact that he knew he wasn't going anywhere. They weren't going to get rid of him. They weren't going to silence him. He had a job to do. He had a mission, and he was going to go ahead and do that regardless. But the interesting aspect about that mission was, when he graduated 35th in the class of 276 people. When he did that, in his graduation, he knew that after he got out, it wasn't necessarily going to be easy for him, because it took his father 40 years to get 1 star. What would happen to him? And so, he most of the people that he was talking to that night were Black officers like myself, field graders, and young Black officers, and there was a cadre of members of the Tuskegee Airmen, and it was great to see them there, resplendent in their red blazers, standing there surrounding him, listening to him talk about some of the hard times that he had. But he never really said that it was hard. He never said that at all. He simply talked about the fact that he had to go through this. He had written a book around that time, I believe written in 1991, called American. That was the title. And he did that because right around the time, African Americans, Black people were struggling. Well, should we be called African Americans? Should we be called Black? And at the time, there was discourse that we should be called African Americans because, although we descended from Africa, we are definitely American, which meant we are inclusive. This is our space. We are part of this country, and we want to be therefore identified as African Americans. It was his contention that he was an American, and he was simply an American because he was like everybody else. He served, he did the best that he could for his country. He didn't feel that he was any different from anybody else, and his service was just as equal and valuable as everyone else. He felt at the time that when you say African American, you hyphenate yourself, you devalue who you are as a person of a political of a particular group. He felt that African Americans were devaluing who they were. Yes, we do know that we were descended from Africa, but where have you been all this other time? Where have you put all of your time? What country have you built up? Where are you today? Where are you going today? So um, I I pick that when I think about patriotism, I think about the fact that literally he had to go through hell to become a graduate of the cadets. And people say, well, it's 4 years. And I seriously doubt if some people could take a day or a week of that type of stuff, of being ignored, of being shunned, of people. And he said it was delightful for him as he went through the ranks when he got to become a like a 3-star, 2-star, 3-star, all of the people who went through the academy with him in his class, many of them ended up apologizing to him for the way that they treated him. Their excuse was, of course, that they had to treat him that way because everyone else was treating them that way. So they wouldn't have done it on their own. And to his credit, and I'll kind of close with this, he gave them no quarter. He didn't say, that's okay, I know that you had to do that. And in essence, he just said, you did what you did. And it ended up actually shaming them for doing and engaging in what I would call such despicable behavior. So watching him stand there and tell that story, Um, and he ended by saying that we should be proud as Black officers of who we are and where we're going, and always be an example as an American to other Black officers who are actually coming along. So if you ever get the chance to read the book, American, published by Benjamin O. Davis Jr., I believe in 1991, please read that. Like I said, that was the greatest experience of my military life, and I was glad to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our next speaker. Turn it back to Brian. Sorry.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. It's a great story. I'd like to move on now to Mr. Brian Henry, who will share his experiences and his research.
Hey, everybody. Can you all hear me? So first off, I'd like to thank Dr. Hillary Lithgow. I don't think she's on the call, but Dr. Lithgow and Dr. Eric Hodges here for inviting me to join the conversation. I think listening to everyone's comments earlier in the beginning, I appreciated a lot of what was said around the identity aspects of veterans, especially when it comes to the intersectionality of identity. You know, a lot of the identities that are shared oftentimes are the core majority identity. You know, in any conversation, especially ones that are academic, because it's the mainstream, you know, and it touches on the most people at the same time. What's difficult, of course, is initiating conversations that go deeper into the other aspects of identity at the same time. And so I appreciate the opportunity to share my experience as it relates to my background. And so just a couple of minutes really briefly, I'll share that, you know, I was adopted from South Korea at 11 months old. As you can imagine from my accent or lack thereof, I was adopted by white American parents, and I've been raised in Arizona and West Virginia in rural America. And so very American values, as you can imagine, being raised as basically being raised as a white Christian male in America in the 80s and 90s, you know, has kind of informed and fueled who I've become as an adult. So, but as you can imagine, being raised in rural America, I did encounter quite a bit of racism and discrimination. Some of the most blatant being people walking up to my mother on the street and asking her why I was with her because I didn't look like her. Experiences like that, of course, in school as well. And so a big piece that I loved someone mentioned in the beginning, I think it was you, Eric, was the idea of solidarity. And one of the biggest pieces that drew me to the military experience was seeking that aspect of belonging, seeking solidarity, and in essence, seeking credibility as an American citizen, which is really, of course, kind of sad that you might have to, in a sense, prove your citizenship or prove your patriotism in this sense. But that was an aspect that I felt, especially as a teenager, would highlight that aspect of my identity. Growing up, of course, I had to deal with a lot of the imposter syndrome, and as some may know, the coined phrase of being the perpetual foreigner, which I still, of course, you know, I still deal with that today. I shared with the others in our small group before that, you know, if I go to the gym, I get a quite different experience when I wear an Army t-shirt at the gym than if I'm just wearing regular workout gear. And it's almost a fascinating experience, almost sociologically fascinating to see people's reactions, how people talk to you, the discussions they might have, conversations they might initiate, just based on that one piece of identity that they then see that they can connect with you. So that has certainly fueled a lot of who I am as well. That being said, that is one of the biggest reasons that I joined the military, but also I joined because I was put up for adoption to the United States on the basis that my birth parents thought that I would have better opportunities in the United States. And so being raised here by loving parents, I am thankful for the opportunities that I've been blessed with and privileged to have in the United States. And so part of me wanted to serve that as well, and serve the country that I was raised in and that I identify with, down to my core. I also was raised in a family of veterans, so that kind of plays into it, as well as you all can imagine. I'm sure many others on the call as well. My father was a Vietnam veteran. I need to ask him more questions before too long here, but he was a Vietnamese linguist. He has a Silver Star and a Presidential Meritorious Unit citation that I do not know where he received those or how he received those, but I'm sure there's quite an interesting story there. And then, of course, my grandparents as well were in the U.S. Army in World War II and Korean War, and so being not born into, but being adopted into this family, of course, has really informed who I have become, as I was growing up. I still remember sitting on my grandfather's knee and him telling me stories about flying in a B-2 bomber over the Pacific. And that was when I was 7 years old or something. And, and that was, as a looking up to your elders, I suppose, but definitely gave me this vision of what a soldier was and what patriotism meant, even at that age. And kind of coincidentally, of course, I was raised in that era of the 80s and 90s, where I remember saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day at the beginning of the school day, every single day of the year, probably until about the end of high school, where in the late 90s, they started to phase that out. So the other piece is, of course, I was in high school sitting in my classroom on 9/11, and I sat in the same classroom with my favorite teacher at the time, choral director, and we sat and watched the entire 9/11 in the same classroom all day long on the news. So from the moment the first plane hit, we turned on the TV and watched for hours, and of course, all in horror and shock. I had a friend whose mother worked in the Pentagon, and I had another friend whose father worked in the Trade Center. And so they were sitting in our class alongside us, and we were crying and praying, and just such a difficult day looking back now. As a junior in high school, that really, of course, initiated something in me to join. And so, of course, 2004 rolled around, and I ended up enlisting in the Air Force. So, and those would be the highlights, at least in my mind, of really why I joined and what fueled my patriotism, that I would say. I decided to write down a brief statement, and I would say that my personal view of patriotism is serving and fighting for a nation and a world where all people, regardless of background or social identities, are welcome. Thank you. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. That was great. That was great. I think we'll open it up now to questions. Eric, did you have some questions queued up?
Well, I was gonna ask first if anybody had any questions. I do have some lurking in the background in case somebody doesn't have anything. If you do have a question, you can either raise your hand or type it in the chat. So when I'm teaching, I have this thing I call the 10-second rule, where whenever I ask a question, I wait at least 10 seconds before I say anything. Okay, I'll get us started. So going back to Max, to your sort of, and this is interesting to me because I'm working on a paper now, right? So this distinction between patriotism and nationalism. In your mind, is there room to value particular things about your country, the regime you live in, whatever, without that actually leading to you judging other regimes? So for example, so I'm asking, I guess really what I'm asking is does this distinction actually hold water between patriotism and nationalism? Can I say, I'm patriotic because I believe in the ideals of America, right? I believe that, in the Declaration of Independence, all men, right, are created equal. There are certain, individual truths. So that's why I feel patriotic, let's say. But can I stop there without looking at another regime like, let's say, the People's Republic of China, for example, where they don't prioritize the same values that we prioritize, and not not go forward and judge that other regime?
Right, sure. I think, certainly on a personal level, I had that feeling of being able to emotionally identify without making that emotional identification into an aspect of exclusion or an exclusionary politics. I do think that that if we're thinking about it historically, though, there's a strong argument to be made that the patriotism nationalism distinction really is a product of the post-war experience and America's unique role as kind of a unique hegemon and superpower over the past since 1945, and we can debate that and America's role in the world and whatnot. But there was kind of a unique, America was ushered into a unique place globally after the Second World War, and oftentimes intellectual distinctions, right, are born out of material geopolitical realities, right?
Right.
And I guess one reason I think that's the case is because if, in my research anyway, when you look pre-1945, when you look into the early 20th century, when you look back into the 19th century, the folks who spoke and wrote about patriotism, you don't find anyone really making this sharp distinction prior to 1945. For example, if you look, Mark Twain wrote a few pieces on patriotism, but he slides very easily, very readily between words like the Union or nation and patriot, right? There isn't this conceptual kind of space. Same with in the 19th century with abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. They speak of unionism, actually was the key term at that time. And so there was, now we could chalk that up to, well, they were just made less conceptually rigorous. But scholars of political rhetoric know that, right? Political rhetoric is not a discipline of philosophy where you make abstract conceptualizations all the time, right? And in political rhetoric, you're telling stories, and it's a messier field of thinking and communication. And of course, Eric, I was going back to Plato. There's always been the desire to put philosophers in the head of
Right.
political communities so that we could get away from that messiness, but that hasn't happened yet, right? So we have to deal, I think, with the messiness of political rhetoric. And if we do, I think the distinction doesn't hold water for me anyway in my research. But that doesn't mean, I think, that the only inevitable conclusion is that any kind of investment in emotion in one's nation is inherently wrong-headed. I still think it's contextual, and we have to think it through. It's nuanced, and it's very much a matter of context, but a kind of sharp distinction where America uniquely developed this version of patriotism that's totally distinct from nationalism. Going back to Merle Curti's argument there in 1946 in that Roots of American Loyalty book, I think it is the more productive place, in part because it also raises the bar for patriotism, the test, intellectually speaking, for us to think about it, rather than just assume it's naturally something altogether distinct from what the rest of the Western world has experienced in terms of nationalism. I don't know if that answers that question, but that's what comes to mind right now.
In other words, it's complicated.
It's complicated, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
and the
it
more
depends.
you take a historical perspective, it becomes harder to insist on the more stricter versions of that distinction.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a couple of other questions. Frank had a question for Liz, and then let's see, Anita has a question as well. So let me ask Frank here. Frank, looks like you're unmuted, so go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, thank you. So Liz, I was really intrigued, actually, as a former equal opportunity officer myself in the Navy, who, you know, had the distinction of serving in that role as one of the majority, right, in the you know, ethnically and gender wise in my command. And something really struck me in what you discussed, which was this idea of an abstract sense of service, but also the idea that as a oftentimes I think minorities have a more refined or perhaps more personalized view of the service that they're doing, which was always my experience as well. And so what I'd love to ask you is, do you think that's the case? Do you think that minorities in the military have actually a more refined view or a less abstract view of service? And if so, what are the implications as we evolve into a much more diverse force? In fact, a force that is even more diverse than the nation it's serving in many cases.
So I'm going to start out by saying I'm third generation military, and my experience growing up in the military, as I was telling the group when we were putting this panel together, that everybody was male, and Army, I'm the only female that actually went into the military in my family, and the only one in the Air Force. Everybody was in the Army. They all encouraged me to go into the Air Force because I would say they didn't think I had the acumen for Army service. I'll put it that way. But in that, what I was always told, and when I would have my, what we call our Franco discussions with my other colleagues, were we knew that when we served, that we're serving to show how much we honored our country, but also to show that our service should be equally as valued as the service of white service people. So that meant you had to be a better officer. You had to test better as an enlisted person when you were going up before your promotion board, or when you had to go test if you were an officer. You had to wear your uniform a certain way. You had to make sure you didn't get in trouble because you would be most likely to get that Article 15. So there was a sense of knowing that you were representing, and there were so few of us, I would say, in different services, particularly, I'm going to say women, female officers, after you field grade officers. So you knew that once you got into a particular slot and role, that there was somebody behind you that had to come. And if you screwed up, people would say, I don't want those type of people in my unit or my company or my squadron because they can't do the job. So while I personally didn't feel that my white counterparts had that pressure or had to be like that. For example, and another example really quickly, they tell you, as women, you know, you're really not supposed to cry when you're in the military if something happens. But as a Black woman, you definitely you should not cry, because if you cried, you showed weakness and you showed that Black people were weak. So do you see this thing that I'm carrying on my shoulders? It's a constant weight that you're carrying on your shoulders. You're carrying the whole race with you. I felt everywhere I went. the higher in rank I got, the more people that I was carrying on my shoulders. And that's why I applaud people like Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and some of the people today, because they carried a lot of people. They weren't necessarily supposed to talk about it. I mean, even at Diomi, I'm sure when you went through Diomi, there were politically accepted platitudes that you could say when you were talking about race, but we had to know what those platitudes were. We had to know when to say them, who they can say them to. And so that was one of the things that I meant about the abstract, because it was something that I carried with me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If people in the community needed somebody to come out and talk about black service in the military, I always would raise my hand to go. As a public affairs officer, I was supposed to do that anyway. But I did it because if I didn't do it, no one else would do it. And then they would say, oh, Black people don't care. So kind of a weird type of thing. I don't have to do that anymore in academia as much, I'll say, but it was tough. So did that answer your question? Or did I kind of go around the circle?
It does address it. I guess I would just ask you, my follow-on would be, as a minority veteran, do you feel that your sense of service is distinct from the sense of service of other veterans?
In a sense, yes, because people will acknowledge the fact that I am a person of color, and I could, say that to my Latinx colleagues, as well as my, colleagues of other minority groups. Yes, I would say that it was distinct because we are still few. And I think the numbers drive the distinctiveness. I don't think it's not necessarily because I'm a Black woman. I think it's the numbers of promotion, how many of us get promoted. I think it's the numbers of us, how many of us are in the ranks. And then it's also the numbers of how many of us get punished and how we get punished, or how we get put out of the service, or why we get put out of the service. In fact, our recent, the new person who is the head of the Pentagon made a statement, we need more senior officers. Where are they? Where are our Black 3 stars and 4 stars? Where are our women 3 stars and 4 stars? Where are they? So I think the numbers really also drive it. As a white male, I wouldn't necessarily say that they have to worry about that so much. They might worry about it in the reverse, where you'll hear, like one guy told me, oh yeah, sure, you're going to make major because you're Black and you're a woman. And I said, how about the fact that I do my job very well? I'm very good at what I do. Does that count for anything? He never even thought about that.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Anita. Anita has a question as well. Let's see. Yep. Go ahead, Anita.
Hi. It wasn't so much a question. It was a comment on the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. And that I guess I would just caution that just simply saying that we as Americans are exceptional in some way doesn't actually make it so. And I think that some of the distinctions that we try to make, where we imagine that we embody to a greater or lesser extent a version of civic patriotism that other folks don't, or the tendency to sort of like compare ourselves with an imaginary European nationalism. I guess I would just say, if the distinction that we make between patriotism and nationalism that many scholars would make, being that patriotism is about the affective connection to the nation, and that nationalism is an assumption of national superiority, a prioritization of our national interests above and beyond others' national interests, then I think that the historical record, speaking as a historian, says that it's impossible for us to decouple nationalism and patriotism going back to the founding of the nation, because we're a settler colonial society. We have no native soil. The soil that we stand on was taken from other people, was taken from other nations. And so from the beginning, our nation has been premised on a notion of national superiority. A nation defined as white landowning males, of course, right? So, the reason that it's tricky to unravel nationalism and patriotism in the United States is because it's embedded in the premise of the nation. Westward expansion is only not genocide if it's seen through a white nationalist paradigm, right? We are only different from European imperial societies if we pretend that we didn't hold the Philippines as a colony, that we didn't take Puerto Rico as a colony, right? I mean, just because we tell ourselves a story doesn't mean that it's true, right? And I think part of the trickiness of detangling the two is that we can't actually detangle them, even though we would like to imagine that we could.
But who's telling the stories? And that would be my rejoinder to that. Who's telling the stories? Primarily our historical stories were told by white males, and they had their vestige of telling their stories. So quote that they sounded right. I would also add too, even though you can't decouple them, you need to throw a third component in there, the decolonization of people that we brought from different countries who didn't want to be here in the first place. So that's another area that we would probably have to look at as well.
Absolutely.
Anybody have any other comments in relation to Anita's comment, or just in general before we wrap up?
I support it. But it makes me think of, I can't remember if it was Roosevelt now, was it FDR that said the big lie? The big lie is you can tell a story over and over and eventually people will accept it as truth, whether or not it is actually true. I can't remember which president said that.
Well, to talk to Max's earlier reference to Plato, it goes all the way back to the Republic, right, where he's talking about the noble lie and how to have a successful regime, you have to have a noble lie in place so that your citizens will feel patriotic and serve in the military and those kinds of things.
Right.
Well, without calling it a lie, Benedict Anderson would call it an imagined community, right? All nations are imagined, and they're imagined through the discourses that the people in power create for us, right? And as Elizabeth points out, our historical narratives were written by white landowning men, right? And that shapes how we understand who we are and what our national character is. It's just jarring it can be jarring when you interview veterans of color, immigrant veterans, minoritized veterans, and hear the way that sometimes these discourses reappear in ways that seem discordant, right?
Hello? You guys still
Sorry.
there?
My phone didn't like what I was saying.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Big Brother was listening in.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've just gotten to